The story of Jeffrey Epstein, his crimes, and the subsequent Epstein Files is one of the most disturbing and complex narratives in modern American history, reflecting a convergence of wealth, power, sexual exploitation, and the pursuit of justice that has captivated the world. Jeffrey Epstein, a financier and convicted sex offender, first came under public scrutiny in the mid-2000s when allegations emerged of his involvement in the sexual abuse of minors, many of whom were recruited into a network that spanned decades and involved numerous high-profile individuals. Epstein's social connections included powerful politicians, celebrities, business magnates, and royalty, creating a web that many believe contributed to the perception of his initial invulnerability to legal consequences. Despite the severity of the allegations, Epstein's initial legal outcomes were surprisingly lenient. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor in Florida, a plea that resulted in a remarkably light sentence, largely due to a controversial non-prosecution agreement that shielded him and potentially implicated co-conspirators from federal charges. The public outcry over this plea deal and the leniency of his sentence fueled years of speculation and investigations into how Epstein's wealth and connections may have influenced justice, and it became a touchstone for debates about accountability in cases involving the powerful. Epstein's story took a dramatic turn in July 2019 when he was arrested on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors in New York and Florida. The indictment detailed a scheme where Epstein allegedly recruited girls, some as young as 14, to engage in sexual acts, often under the guise of providing them mentorship or financial support. Investigators revealed a pattern in which young women were lured with promises of money, career advancement, or gifts, and then exploited sexually, sometimes with other wealthy and influential individuals. The federal charges marked a turning point in the public's awareness of Epstein's activities and set the stage for unprecedented scrutiny of his associates. Epstein's arrest also sparked renewed attention to the failures of the justice system in his earlier case, particularly the non-prosecution agreement, which many viewed as emblematic of the disparities in treatment between the wealthy and the powerless. The indictment and subsequent legal proceedings also reignited questions about the extent to which Epstein's network facilitated and perpetuated abuse, prompting both journalists and independent investigators to explore every facet of his life and connections. One of the most consequential developments following Epstein's 2019 arrest was his death in a Manhattan jail cell in August of that year, officially ruled a suicide. Epstein's death immediately generated intense speculation and conspiracy theories, fueled by the fact that he had connections to highly influential individuals and that standard protocols at the Metropolitan Correctional Center were reportedly not fully observed on the night of his death. The failure of the jail system to prevent his death, despite prior suicide attempts, and the high-profile nature of his case, intensified public outrage and suspicion, leading to a myriad of investigations into the circumstances surrounding his demise. Epstein's death did not end the legal reckoning. Instead, it shifted the focus toward his estate, ongoing investigations into his associates, and the broader implications of the abuse network he had allegedly cultivated over decades. Victims and advocacy groups continued to seek justice, arguing that Epstein's death should not allow those who enabled or participated in his crimes to escape accountability. The release of the Epstein Files by the U.S. Department of Justice represents one of the most significant developments in understanding the full scope of Epstein's activities and connections. These files, consisting of nearly 30,000 pages of documents, photos, emails, flight logs, court records, and investigative materials, provide unprecedented insight into the operations of Epstein's network and the interactions he had with high-profile figures. The documents were made public under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a legislative measure passed to ensure accountability and public access to information about the case, particularly after years of controversy regarding secrecy and alleged preferential treatment in the justice system. The DOJ's release has been staggered due to the massive volume of materials, the need for redactions to protect victims' identities, and the complexity of the documents. many of which contain references to sensitive information and ongoing investigations. The files offer a detailed view of the mechanisms Epstein allegedly used to recruit and manipulate young women, as well as the intricate web of personal and professional relationships that may have facilitated or obscured these activities. Analysis of the Epstein Files has revealed patterns in the recruitment and abuse of minors, highlighting the sophisticated methods Epstein employed to exploit vulnerabilities, maintain secrecy, and leverage his social standing. The documents contain flight logs that document trips on Epstein's private jet, sometimes with notable public figures, along with hotel records, emails, and other forms of communication that suggest coordination and planning. However, the DOJ has emphasized that the mere presence of individuals in these documents does not imply wrongdoing or criminal involvement, and many materials remain heavily redacted to ensure the protection of victims and the integrity of ongoing investigations. Among the more sensitive revelations are thousands of images seized from Epstein's residences in New York and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which include nude and partially nude photographs of minors, further corroborating the allegations of sexual exploitation and emphasizing the scale and severity of the abuse. The files have also included internal communications within the DOJ and FBI, providing insight into the investigative process, decisions regarding prosecutions, and challenges encountered in building cases against Epstein and potentially complicit associates. The public reaction to the release of the Epstein Files has been intense and multifaceted. Advocates for survivors and victims' rights have largely welcomed the transparency, viewing the documents as a critical step in acknowledging and documenting the suffering of those exploited by Epstein. They argue that access to these files is essential for historical record, public understanding, and the potential identification of additional victims or perpetrators. Conversely, the release has also prompted criticism regarding the handling of sensitive information, particularly the extensive redactions, the organization of the documents, and the inclusion of unverified or misleading materials. Public figures mentioned in the documents, including former President Donald Trump and other high-profile individuals, have issued statements emphasizing that inclusion in flight logs or photographs does not constitute evidence of illegal activity, highlighting the tension between public interest, reputational concerns, and the need for factual accuracy. Legal implications of the Epstein Files continue to evolve. Although Epstein himself is deceased, his estate remains subject to civil litigation from numerous victims seeking compensation, and ongoing investigations are examining potential co-conspirators and facilitators of his criminal activities. The files have become a key resource for attorneys, journalists, and researchers seeking to piece together the extent of Epstein's network and the systemic failures that allowed him to evade more severe consequences for many years. Additionally, the files have contributed to broader discussions about the justice system's handling of cases involving influential individuals, highlighting disparities in treatment, the impact of wealth and social connections on legal outcomes, and the challenges of securing accountability in complex, multi-jurisdictional investigations. Scholars and commentators have also noted the files' potential to inform policy reforms, particularly regarding transparency, oversight of correctional and investigative agencies, and protections for vulnerable populations. The Epstein Files story also reflects profound social and cultural implications. It underscores the vulnerability of minors in the face of exploitation, the power dynamics inherent in relationships between wealthy individuals and those they target, and the broader societal mechanisms that can enable or obscure abuse. The widespread media coverage and public fascination with the Epstein case illustrate how high-profile criminal cases intersect with issues of celebrity, wealth, and political influence, shaping public perception and policy discourse. The release of the files has sparked debates about privacy, the ethics of public access to sensitive materials, and the responsibilities of journalists and researchers in interpreting and disseminating information in ways that respect both the victims and the principles of due process. Furthermore, the Epstein story has catalyzed discussions about the cultural and institutional factors that allow sexual exploitation to persist, prompting calls for systemic reform in areas ranging from legal oversight to corporate responsibility and media accountability. In conclusion, the Epstein Files story is not only a chronicle of one man's crimes, but also a lens through which to examine the intersections of power, privilege, and justice in contemporary society. The release of tens of thousands of pages of documents by the DOJ has provided unprecedented access to the inner workings of Epstein's network, offering insights into the recruitment, exploitation, and abuse of minors, the complicity or inadvertent involvement of high-profile individuals, and the systemic failures that allowed these crimes to persist over decades. While the full implications of the files are still unfolding, the documentation of Epstein's activities represents a crucial step toward accountability, public awareness, and historical record. It has sparked legal, political, and social discussions that will continue to resonate for years as victims seek justice, lawmakers pursue reforms, and society grapples with the uncomfortable truths revealed by the extensive documentation of one of the most notorious cases of sexual exploitation in modern history. The Epstein Files serve as a stark reminder of the need for vigilance, transparency, and a commitment to justice, emphasizing that no individual, regardless of wealth or influence, should be above the law, and that the protection of vulnerable populations must remain a societal priority.